professor in the Department of Environmental and Molecular Toxicology and director of the Environmental Health Science Center at Oregon State University. She has a bachelor's degree in environmental science and biology from Michigan State University, and also a PhD degree in environmental science and neuroscience from Indiana University, Bloomington. She has completed a postdoctoral training in ecotoxicology and immunotoxicology and was faculty at East Carolina University before she moved to Oregon State in 2023. She is also a diplomat of the American Board of Toxicology and is active within the Society of Toxicology and the Society of Environmental Toxicology and Chemistry. Her laboratory's research program focus on functional effects of environmental chemicals on the immune system and its interactions with the nervous system during development and adulthood. So with this introduction, I'll welcome Dr. Jamie DeWitt. Thank you so much for being here today. It's an honor to have you, and you're more than welcome to start your presentation when you're ready.
All right, thank you so much. Well, hello everybody. It's nice to be virtually back at East Carolina University. I just left a year and a half ago, and I'll actually be in town next week for a meeting in Raleigh and then a student's defense at ECU. So it'll be almost like I'm coming home. For those of you who know a little bit about me, you probably know that I've been involved in studying the toxicity, specifically the immunotoxicity of PFAS for about 2 decades now. I first started studying them in 2005 during my postdoctoral training at the US EPA. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why PFAS are health and environmental concerns. I'll talk a little bit about some common misconceptions, but I'm also going to talk about the essential use concept and how we can use the essential use concept to manage PFAS. Now, I am not a sustainability expert. I'm not a regulatory scientist or manager. So the opinions that I offer are based on my experience with PFAS as a scientist. I'm also going to ask a few questions that I hope you can answer in the chat. So whenever I ask a question, feel free to put the answer in the chat, and I'll be monitoring the chat for those answers to questions. So I just want to share a few declarations. I do receive state and federal funding. Actually, some of my state funding is still from North Carolina because I'm studying some of the PFAS of concern in North Carolina. So I have funding to study the toxicological effects of PFAS. I was a member of the US EPA's PFAS Science Advisory Board, which was advisory to the EPA as they considered regulatory requirements under the Safe Drinking Water Act for PFOA and PFOS. I was also a PFAS fellow at the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality in 2022 and worked with the PFAS team there on science-based decision-making. But I talk about PFAS a lot. I think it's because I'm an academic scientist. I'm readily available to many people who want to ask questions, and I'm happy to talk to anybody about PFAS and share my scientific experience and understanding of PFAS. So here's a brief outline. I'm just going to go over what PFAS are in case anybody's not familiar with them. I'm going to talk a little bit about the essential use concept. I'll give some examples of how the essential use concept has been applied in various states across the US, and then I'll end with a few final thoughts. So first, let's dive into PFAS. I'm going to keep this pretty high level, so if you're new to PFAS, hopefully you'll gain a broad understanding of what they are and why I, as a scientist, am concerned about them. So first, PFAS is an acronym for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. This is a very large class of synthetic compounds that are defined by having a chain of carbons where the hydrogen that is normally attached is replaced with a fluorine. I've got some PFAS structures on my next slide. PFAS can be subgrouped into different categories. The ones that we are most familiar with are going to be the PFAAs, perfluoroalkyl acids. So some PFAS you may have heard of include PFOA and PFOS. Those are perfluoroalkyl acids. PFOA was the focus of a movie called Dark Waters starring Mark Ruffalo. It was about an attorney who tried to file, or who successfully filed and won, a class action lawsuit against one of the manufacturers of PFAS. There's also been a documentary called The Devil We Know. And I believe there's a new documentary out called Gen X, a Chemical Cocktail, which is a relatively new documentary. But as I mentioned, there are different subclasses of PFAS, and they can be distinguished from one another by how many carbons there are in the chain, how many fluorines there are, and what different functional groups they have. Does anybody, so here's a question for the chat, does anybody know the total number of individual PFAS chemicals that have been identified to date? Just a ballpark number. Place it in the chat. I wish that I had some sort of a wager to offer you. Anybody? Well, I can tell you that 6 PFAS, oh, there we go, 14,000. So Gabrielle has won the prize. Yeah, about 14,000 individual PFAS structures have been identified, and this is through the US EPA's computational toxicology dashboard, where they search for chemical structures. So here's some examples of what some different PFAS chemistries look like. What I've included here are examples of 2 what we call long chain compounds and 2 what we call short chain compounds. So this is a bit of an arbitrary designation that has been applied to enhance management of certain types of PFAS. So PFOA and PFOS are considered to be long chain perfluoroalkyl acids. PFOA has 8 carbons, PFOS has 8 carbons. And it is thought that those PFAAs that are like PFOA and PFOS that have a greater number of carbons have a greater number of characteristics of concern that I'll be going into. Some of the PFAS structures that have been developed to replace these longer chain chemistries, we refer to often as short chain compounds. But as you can see here from Gen X, it's a little bit different from PFOA, PFOS, and PFBS, is that it has this oxygen group in between 2 of the carbons. That makes it a perfluoral ether acid. And yes, there will be a quiz about the acronyms later. It was originally, at least as far as my understanding, designed in so that oxygen could be a place where the compound could break apart, but that actually doesn't happen because the strength of the bond between chemistry and fluorine is so strong. Microbes and enzymes can't get in to break that bond. So that oxygen really kind of acts like another carbon. So this is one way that PFAS can be subdivided into their chain lengths, sometimes by their functional groups, sometimes whether or not they have an oxygen in between the carbons. Why are PFAS used? Well, as you can see from the diagram here, they're used in many different products and processes, and they're used because of that strength of the carbon-fluorine bond. It gives the compounds great strength to withstand many different conditions. For example, they're used in O-rings on the space shuttle, as far as I understand. So they can withstand high heat, different chemical conditions that would be considered hazardous. They can be used as starting materials for certain products. They can use to facilitate the production of other products. But I think one of the questions that you should start asking yourself with respect to sustainability and principles of green chemistry is whether or not PFAS actually need to be in all of the different products and processes. So are they necessary for the function of that product to do what it needs to do for society? And that's at the core of the essential use process. And you can see they're used in many different product categories. And so again, the question is, are they necessary in all of these different product categories? So I'm going to go through now some of the characteristics of concerns for PFAS. And it looks like we have a question in the chat about what is the smallest chain length that would still qualify something as a PFAS. To my understanding, the simplest PFAS is trifluoroacetic acid, and that is a carbon with 3 fluorines attached to it. So that is the very simplest PFAS. It is actively being debated right now as to whether or not it can occur naturally or if it's a product of degradation of other PFAS that can degrade, as something we can discuss as a group at the end of my presentation. But one of the characteristics of concern of PFAS is that they get emitted into the environment when they themselves are made. So when PFAS are produced, they can get emitted into the environment. When PFAS are applied to different products in which they're used, there's the potential for them to get emitted into the environment. When products containing PFAS are used, there can be a small portion of the PFAS associated with that product that can be emitted into the environment. And then when PFAS are disposed of, as they break down, they can be emitted into the environment. And so during the life cycle of PFAS production and use, they can be emitted into the environment, which makes this a characteristic of concern. Another characteristic of concern is the persistence of PFAS. Persistence is the amount of time that it takes them to degrade naturally in the environment. And by naturally, I mean because of heat or water or microbial action. So if we look here, we can see some examples of other persistent organic pollutants and their environmental breakdown times. I studied PCBs and dioxins when I was in graduate school, and they take 8 to 15 years to degrade in water. And at the time, we thought that was a very long time. About how long does it take for PFAS to naturally degrade in the environment? Anybody have any ideas? Go ahead and pop that into the chat if you think you know. Well, I don't see any responses coming in, so I'll pop up 10,000 years. So yes, it's thought that the degradation of PFAS may occur on geologic timescales. Now, there are some compounds that are considered to be PFAS that scientists refer to as precursor compounds. These are PFAS that can degrade, but they degrade into end products that are PFAS that do not degrade. So they're not really truly biodegradable because when they degrade into stable PFAS end products that don't degrade. And this is one of the problems with precursor compounds. Another characteristic of concern is that PFAS can move from the environment into the bodies of living organisms, including humans. Some biomonitoring efforts have indicated that 98 to 99% of people in the United States have one or more PFAS detectable in their blood. And that's concerning. It means that their contamination across the United States and likely across the globe is widespread. If we look at the half-life estimates here for some PFAS, you can see some could get excreted from our body within 3 days. And this is a half-life, right? So 3 days represents the amount of time that it takes for half of the PFAS that got into the body to get excreted. But then there are some that can take years to be excreted. This is concerning because people are exposed to low concentrations chronically, so that gives time for the PFAS to build up in the body. And if we think about pharmacological agents that we take for therapeutic uses, their half-lives are on the order of hours, sometimes days, and those that do have a half-life of days are considered to be highly toxic and are often very carefully monitored in patients by physicians. So if we look at PFOA and PFOS, this is biomonitoring through the Centers for Disease Control. We can see that some years we see declines in PFOA and PFOS in the blood of people. It demonstrates that efforts that have been made to phase out these PFAS are positive. That means that people are getting exposed to lower amounts less frequently, and that results in lower bioaccumulation in humans that are being monitored. But this is not true for all populations, especially for populations that have ongoing PFAS contamination in their communities. Another characteristic of concern is mobility. PCBs and dioxins, for example, tend to stay relatively localized. They are highly lipophilic. They like being in fat. They like being in sediment, so they don't spread points distant from points where they're released. PFAS, on the other hand, are both lipophilic and hydrophilic, so they have a little bit of both properties. So they're comfortable being in water or comfortable being in fats. That means that they can travel to points distant from points where they're released. And that's what these graphs highlight here. So this is a study done by scientists at the US EPA. And right here is a fluoropolymer production facility. It's on the banks of the Ohio River between West Virginia and Ohio. And this was actually the main scene of the movie Dark Waters. But if you look here at all these little bars, they represent sampling locations where soil samples were collected by these scientists. And what they measured was PFOA and then its replacement Gen X, or hexafluoropropylene oxide dimer acid. And what they found is that they could detect concentrations of these two PFAS up to 40 kilometers away from the point of emission. They really weren't able to find where that spread ended. So the concern is that PFAS can move away from points where they're released, which makes this a characteristic of concern. Another characteristic of concern is exposure. People and wildlife can get exposed to PFAS across different pathways and through different routes. So these represent different pathways by which PFAS can get into the environment. That means that we can get exposed through the water that we drink, the food that we eat, the air that we breathe, and what can be absorbed through the skin. Now, all of these exposure routes have not been well studied. We still don't know how much PFAS people inhale. We still don't really know how much PFAS can be absorbed across the skin. The vast majority of people are exposed to PFAS through food or water, and some of that depends on where you live and the types of food that you eat. But we know that PFAS can get into the environment and therefore into the bodies of living organisms through these different pathways, which makes this a characteristic of concern. And then another characteristic of concern is their toxicity. PFAS have been linked to many different diseases in people that have been studied through epidemiological studies. Much of these findings have been replicated in experimental animal models. In toxicology, we call PFAS multi-system toxicants because they're able to impact multiple systems in the body. So if you look here, you can see the different types of diseases that have been linked to PFAS exposure, things from testicular and kidney cancer to deficits in the immune system, impacts on the liver, impacts on the cardiovascular system through increases in cholesterol, and then impacts on children as they develop in utero. So some of these are higher certainty or lower certainty, but as more data emerge from toxicological studies and epidemiological studies, these certainties will increase, or our understanding of the certainty of these diseases will increase. There's also been an explosion of scientists studying PFAS, so more data will likely emerge with respect to other systems that they may impact. Some of you with a deeper toxicological understanding may be asking, well, what's the molecular pathway by which PFAS work? There are many different hypotheses, and one that is prevailing is that there may be many different mechanisms that could be tissue or even cell specific. For example, I study the immune system, and it may be that T cells and B cells of the immune system could be impacted differently through different molecular pathways because PFAS are able to interact with many different receptors in the body. So I'm going to take a quick pause here and see if anybody has any questions that they'd like to ask. And we can save all of the questions for the end, but if anybody has a clarifying question, I'm happy to answer it right now. The problem with webinars like this is that I can't look you in your eyes and make you uncomfortable for staying silent. So I'll go ahead and move on and talk a little bit about the essential use concept. And I've made sure to include plenty of time for questions and discussions at the end of the presentation. So the essential use concept was first developed under the Montreal Protocol, and the Montreal Protocol was a protocol to reduce and eliminate ozone depleting substances with a primary focus on chlorofluorocarbons. This was a multi-national agreement. Many different countries signed on to the Montreal Protocol and worked together to reduce emissions of compounds that could deplete the ozone layer. And what I have here on the left is an image from the NASA Ozone Watch that shows after the Montreal Protocol was instituted, the size of the ozone hole diminished. So this demonstrated that this widespread policy change had a measurable impact on ozone in the atmosphere. And as you all probably recall, ozone is necessary to protect us from some of the harmful rays of the sun. So under the Montreal Protocol, an essential use was defined as a use that is necessary for the health or the safety or the functioning of society. So one of the derogations or allowable uses of chlorofluorocarbons under the Montreal Protocol when it was initially instituted was as a propellant in inhalers for asthma. So that was determined to be an essential use for health. So these compounds were allowed in inhalers for asthma. It doesn't mean that they were forever allowed. I believe that they have gradually been phased out and replaced with other compounds. So one of the key elements of the essential use concept is that even if something is considered essential at a particular point in time, it doesn't mean that the search for sustainable alternatives should stop. So another aspect of the essential use concept is that at the time a decision is being made, there are no available technologically or economically feasible alternatives. So the essential use concept should inspire those who develop chemicals to search for alternatives using green chemistry approaches. And this concept then was applied to PFAS by a group of scientists with whom I work. We are members of what's known as the Global PFAS Science Panel, although we're not really global because it's mostly people from the United States and Europe. But we get together to talk about and to write papers on how we can advance PFAS science and how we can help decision makers to use science to make decisions about managing PFAS. Now, we're not managers, so we don't say you should do this, but we say here's some scientific evidence that could be used in helping to frame management decisions around PFAS. And so we took the Montreal Protocol essential use concept and applied it to PFAS and said, okay, if we applied this protocol, could we come up with some suggestions or guidelines about essential uses for PFAS? Well, one of the problems with PFAS is there's 14,000 individual chemicals. To my knowledge, there's about 250 or 260 that are actively used in commerce, but it's debatable because currently there aren't any really good global inventories on what and how much PFAS are used in various processes. There are even some facets of industry that don't realize that there are PFAS in their products. It can be very challenging to uncover where PFAS are in a particular supply chain, especially for products that have a very intricate supply chain. I talked to somebody from a flooring manufacturer at a meeting in the past and said, well, why can't you figure out what PFAS are in flooring materials? And they said, well, you have to understand that flooring is a pretty complex product. So when you purchase something like a carpet square, there are many different layers in that carpet square. You've got adhesives, you've got backing, you've got dyes, you've got textiles. And they said that there are many different suppliers for those products. So figuring out where the PFAS are in that supply chain is extremely challenging. Now, there have been some companies that have been able to phase PFAS out of their products and processes, but it takes years to figure out where the PFAS are and what substitutes can be brought in. The Keen Shoe Company, for example, and I don't own any money in Keen Shoes, they're just a local company here in Oregon. They managed to phase PFAS out of their footwear line, and they are happy to share their experience with others who would like to make that decision. But if you look at this particular slide, you can see because PFAS are used in so many different product categories, it may be challenging to uncover where those PFAS are and make efforts to phase PFAS out of that product, especially if it's something that is fairly complex, as I mentioned, in terms of supply chains. There's over 60 different use categories that have been identified for PFAS, and this isn't just individual products. These are different use categories. So if you think about something like apparel, there's rain gear, there's footwear, there's pants, there's shirts. There could be PFAS in many different types of apparel, including those for children and infants and those for adults. There's also food contact materials. There's many different types of food contact materials. Here in the United States, the Food and Drug Administration has phased PFAS out of certain types of food contact materials, but not out of all food contact materials. So it can, as I said, be sometimes challenging to figure out where those PFAS are. There are even some areas of PFAS use where the function of the PFAS is unclear. For example, a colleague shared a story one time of a bicycle chain oil. They went to a bicycle store and there were two types of bicycle chain oil, one that had a fluoropolymer in it and one that did not. And my colleague asked the store owner, well, why do you have these two options? Why don't you just have the one that doesn't have PFAS in it? And they said, well, the PFAS one sells better. There's not really a difference as far as I know in these two oils. So there's lack of clarity sometimes about why PFAS are added into certain products. It may just be habit. It may be because that's where the product came from, because the product had PFAS in it. So I think articulating the actual function of the PFAS in the product will be an important way to start to figure out whether or not a PFAS can be phased out of a particular product or product use category. So this is one of the approaches that the group that I work with came up with for how the essential use concept could be applied to PFAS, and that would be to group compounds into three different categories: non-essential, substitutable, and essential. And there are different definitions under each of these, and I'll go through some of these in more detail. But we did this as a way to help managers maybe think about how they wanted to group PFAS if they decided that they wanted to start phasing PFAS out of products and processes. So it's also important here to mention alternatives. It's important that there are not regrettable substitutions. In other words, if you're going to substitute something else for the PFAS, it's important that what is substituted has a better toxicological profile, is biodegradable, and meets additional characteristics of green chemistry. So it's a regrettable substitution would be substituting a compound that doesn't really improve the toxicological profile and doesn't have enhanced biodegradability or reduced bioaccumulation, for example. So I'm going to go through the different categories. So category one would be non-essential uses of PFAS. And one of the categories that we highlighted would be pharmaceutical or personal care products. So are PFAS essential for the health, safety, and functioning of society to be in cosmetics? So my understanding is that they're often put into cosmetics to improve spreadability. Are there substitutes that are available? Well, our work said yes, there are substitutes that are available that don't have the characteristics of concern that PFAS have. So application of PFAS in cosmetics would be a non-essential use of a PFAS. And many different cosmetics companies have worked or are working to phase PFAS out of their cosmetics and personal care products. A substitutable would be a category where you can apply something else that does meet those criteria for green chemistry. So there are certain types of breathable membranes that are necessary for water repellency that can be replaced by other compounds or other products. There are some compounds that use different types of PFAS. So there are other PFAS that are shorter chain chemistries that could be used in terms of replacing longer chain PFAS, but the goal would be to substitute these membranes with something that is not a PFAS, if that is the decision of the decision makers who would be applying this particular concept to PFAS. Category 3 would be those PFAS that are considered to be essential. So in other words, they confer a property that is necessary for the health, safety, or functioning of society, and for which there are no current substitutes that enhance sustainability. An example that we came up with would be some of the equipment that is used to protect first responders. There are active areas of research being explored in this area to determine if there are substitutable compounds that confer the necessity that PFAS confer in these various products. For example, firefighter turnout gear has a membrane in it that is water repellent. There's coatings on it that are water and grease repellent. This is necessary to ensure that our firefighters are protected during their active firefighting activities. But the question has been raised as to whether the PFAS truly are essential in these products and whether there are alternatives available. So this is an active area of research. There's actually some faculty at North Carolina State University who are working in this particular area, and they're in the textiles area. So I wanted to mention real briefly fluoropolymers. This is an area that's being discussed quite a bit, especially in the European Union. So the European Union is considering a global or a widespread PFAS restriction, and there's been some efforts to have fluoropolymers excluded from that definition, with the idea that fluoropolymers themselves are non-toxic, they're inert, they shouldn't be treated in the same way as other PFAS. That may be true for fluoropolymers themselves. I'm not aware of any detailed toxicity studies that have been performed on fluoropolymers, so I can't say definitively that they are without toxicological concerns. But I think when fluoropolymers are discussed, it's important to go back to that life cycle perspective. Fluoropolymers can emit PFAS when they're produced, when they're used, and when they're disposed of. So if you consider a life cycle perspective, fluoropolymers are not actually sustainable and are not of low concern when you consider the life cycle. There's also some emerging concerns in the medical field that there may be health effects that can arise from fluoropolymers used in meshes, for example, that can get put in the body. Some surgeons who work with patients who receive certain types of meshes that are fluoropolymers call these meshes, when people have an immune reaction against them, they call them Teflon granulomas. So Teflon is a type of fluoropolymer. It's a brand name for a fluoropolymer. And the question is whether these are very specific to Teflon or if they're just generalized granulomas. So that's an area of research that needs to be explored. I'm going to briefly go through some of the approaches done in different states, and then I'll share a few final thoughts, and then we should have plenty of time for discussion. So some states here in the United States have taken action to phase PFAS out of various products and processes. And you can see here some of the areas where they've really been able to focus. So cookware, textiles, some film forming foams, upholstery, which kind of falls under the category of textiles, and then footwear. The first state to implement a phase out was the state of Maine. I believe that January of 2040 will be the final stage of the phase out. But as you can see here, they've implemented various stages of the phase out to give industries in those areas time to find substitutes or plead the case for essentiality under the law in Maine to allow their material to continue to contain PFAS. So you can see here, carpet or rugs, fabric treatments have been phased out in the state of Maine. And by January of 2026, many other products will not be allowed to be sold in Maine if they contain what are known as intentionally added PFAS. And you can see this applies to a lot of personal care and cosmetic products. Recently, Minnesota passed a law called Amara's Law, which will restrict the use of intentionally added PFAS in a variety of different products similar to those in the state of Maine. And this was named after a young lady named Amara. She passed away before she was 21. She had rare types of cancer, and she and her family were certain that Amara's cancer arose from her exposure to PFAS. And so Amara has testified before different government bodies about her experience being sickened by what she believed to be her exposure to PFAS. And she and her family worked very hard to get this bill considered, and eventually it was passed by the state of Minnesota. Minnesota is one of the first states to file a lawsuit against a fluoro manufacturer, and they did settle that lawsuit, I believe, in 2017 or 2018 through a natural resource damage assessment claim. If you Google that, you can look it up and find out information. So Safer States is a really great website that lists out different states that have enacted protections for their citizens with respect to hazardous chemicals. I pulled out information specifically related to PFAS and highlight some of the states here that have made efforts to incorporate phase outs of intentionally added PFAS in various products and processes. You can go to Safer States to look in a little more detail at those states if you'd like to. And so what's reflected here in this map are some of the states that have introduced, adopted, or introduced and adopted various policies for PFAS. So they don't distinguish what the states are doing on this particular map, but you can look up all of the information. And as you can see, firefighting foams are some of the most, I guess, popular actions by states to phase out PFAS. And I don't know definitively, but I think one of the reasons is that when foams are used either in training activities or to extinguish actual fires, they end up getting into surface water and groundwater and contaminating relatively large areas and community members in relatively large areas. So it was viewed by some states as an important step forward for reducing contamination to a great number of people in particular states. So just a few final thoughts. So I'm sharing with you a paper published in 2023, some data from a paper published in 2023. This paper highlights that as biomonitoring of various PFAS continues, we do see declines in levels of PFAS in males and females measured across the populations. Some of these compounds are remaining steady. Some look like they might be increasing a little bit. These are just a few PFAS that are part of biomonitoring efforts by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. But I think what's important to remember is that there are many other PFAS compounds that are in the environment, and for many of them, there's no biomonitoring information. So we don't really know what the levels of some of these understudied PFAS are in people. So it'll be important to expand biomonitoring efforts to truly understand whether or not phase outs of PFAS are being effective. I wanted to share with you a few sources of information. These are areas where you can go to get information on exposure. So PFAS Exchange allows you to get information on what your exposure might be. Toxic Free Future has information on alternatives that you could think about purchasing. So does Green Science Policy Institute. If you want some more science-based information, ATSDR has PFAS pages. They have a toxicological profile for PFAS. They also have some guidance documents for clinicians. EPA, the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, and the National Toxicology Program all have information related to PFAS. And actually, the National Toxicology Program, I think, has changed its name, so I might need to update that. The Environmental Working Group is a nonprofit organization that has a PFAS map. So they highlight areas of the United States where PFAS contamination has been confirmed. One thing that I'd like to point out about this map is that you may think, oh, I'm going to move to New Mexico. They have hardly any PFAS. Well, this map doesn't necessarily reflect known PFAS contamination sites. it reflects states that have investigated PFAS. So yes, it's known contamination sites, but some states just haven't explored PFAS contamination. So a state with relatively little contamination may not have much PFAS contamination, but it may also mean that they really haven't looked throughout the state to find what is there. So if you look at Michigan, for example, and North Carolina and the Northeast, these states have engaged in efforts to uncover sites of PFAS contamination. Well, with that, I'm going to end to see if you have any questions. I thank you for listening, and I look forward to answering any questions. And Marley, would you like me to stop sharing, or should I keep sharing?
Please keep sharing the slides. Thank you, Dr. DeWitt.
Okay.
This was very insightful, and I think we have some questions. So let me read them for you. 1 second. Well, one question I see here from Mr. Scott Pfister. He says, as an end user industry, we're seeing responsibility for testing being pushed on us, like spills, stormwater, wastewater pretreatment. However, we're only as good as our SDS. What is OSHA doing to require can manufacturers to include information on PFAS on SDS? I've been asking about PFAS in our CAM approval process, but I sometimes receive not intentionally added.
Yeah, Scott, I think that is an area a little bit outside of my expertise, but I understand how frustrating it can be. I think first, there's confusion about how PFAS should be defined. This is an area of debate in terms of what is a PFAS and who has oversight for PFAS. I think once that gets established, it'll be a little bit easier to identify PFAS on safety data sheets, for example. PFAS can be, I guess, byproducts of certain types of processes. Some containers, for example, may have some sort of a fluorination spray put on the inside of it that can create some PFAS. So it's not intentionally added, but it can end up being a detectable level in containers, especially containers for pesticides. I don't really know the answer to that, and I don't know what OSHA is doing with respect to safety data sheets for PFAS that are not intentionally added or a major constituent of a particular product. I really empathize with you and wastewater treatment facilities, for example. Wastewater treatment facilities end up getting accused of contributing to PFAS contamination, but they're not the producers, they're the flow through, and I think they're doing the best that they can to meet all appropriate regulations and requirements under the various acts that they have to comply with to provide water to their consumers. I wish I had a better answer for you.
Thank you, Dr. DeWitt. Is there any other question that we can bring to Dr. DeWitt? Let's take a look here. I see another question. What are the most effective treatment methods currently available for removing PFAS from water sources?
That's a good question. So there are different technologies available. One that tends to be more affordable for communities is known as granular activated carbon. This is just like a charcoal filter, for example, that you could have in a filter in your refrigerator at home. These do have a certain capacity and they do have to be changed after so many years. Some PFAS can start to break through. They're called GAC filters, so it's important that water treatment facilities pick an appropriate compound for monitoring. In North Carolina, there are some compounds that have been identified as the breakthrough compounds, and so they're monitored. Reverse osmosis appears to be very effective, but it can be cost prohibitive for some communities, and it does produce quite a bit of waste. There are some innovative technologies that are being explored by different companies. There are some other filtration options. There are some destructive technologies, but I'm not sure if they're
if they're ready for being scaled up. I don't know if you all can still hear me. Sorry, sometimes in Teams, my microphone and camera will just switch automatically. So I don't know if some of these other technologies are quite ready for scaling up to a bigger facility.
Thanks so much. We have another question here from Mr. Connor Jarvis. In the lens of substitution, are short chain PFAS more preferable to long chain counterparts?
So I think industries that make and use PFAS have switched to shorter chain compounds. Part of this is because of a stewardship agreement that the US EPA entered into with some of the major manufacturers here in the United States, with the understanding that short chains could be implemented to replace the long chain chemistries. What is emerging, though, toxicologically, is that some of these short chain alternatives produce similar toxicological outcomes to the long chain counterparts, although they may have lower potency with respect to their ability to produce these toxicities. But there are some emerging data to indicate that the short chains might be more toxic for certain endpoints. So I think that the overall sense in the toxicological community is that there are very few PFAS that are without toxicological hazard, which means that when people are exposed, there is a risk of adverse health outcomes occurring from that exposure. So I guess the answer to that would be, if the PFAS is not essential, then efforts could be made to find a non-PFAS alternative.
Thank you, Dr. DeWitt. Any other question from the audience? We have some time still to answer a few questions. I do have a question, so I give some time to the rest of the audience to think about. But I'm curious about PFAS and carpets. I think I remember one previous webinar from the EPA saying that California implemented some laws restricting PFAS on carpets. So I don't know much how this works, but what's the level of exposure on carpets currently? Like, is it something to be concerned, or should people be doing something to improve the carpets at their homes, like doing a particular type of cleaning, or is not something to be too worried about?
I don't know if we know exactly the concentration of PFAS that people can be exposed to in their homes if they have a surface protectant on their carpet that is PFAS based. It is detectable. So some people from Duke University, Heather Stapleton's lab, for example, have done studies where they've taken hand wipes of children. Children are on the floor crawling around, and they were able to detect PFAS on the hands of children. But I think really when you think about PFAS as they're applied to carpets, the bigger issue is that life cycle issue. So PFAS have to be applied to carpets and other textiles. And where the PFAS are applied, there is a very high probability of emission into the environment, which means that the people who live near or downstream from those application facilities are going to be bearing the brunt of exposure. So the end user will experience some exposure, but their exposure will be lower than the people who live near the facilities that make or apply those PFAS.
Thank you so much. Let's see, we have any other question? Okay, I think there is one question here. Let me see. Does a shorter chain PFAS break down faster, and that is considered a better alternative in the meantime?
So to my knowledge, the only PFAS that can break down are the precursor compounds. And many of these are the fluorotelomere compounds or the side chain fluorinated compounds. Those do break down into other PFAS. So Gen X, PFBS, PFMOAA, compounds with a lower number of carbon chains do not break down. So if PFMOAA which has 3 carbons, I believe, is released into the environment, it stays as PFMOAA in the environment. If Gen X is released into the environment, it stays as Gen X into the environment. So the difference between long chain, short chain with respect to degradation, there is no difference. They are equally resistant to degradation unless they're a precursor compound, but then they break down into PFAS that don't degrade. It is thought, though, that short chain compounds, and there is experimental evidence to support this, that they are excreted more rapidly from the body. So there's less time for them to hang out in the body to interact with biological molecules, but they can still interact with biological molecules to produce toxicity, even in the short time that they are in the body.
Thank you for that. Well, we're getting pretty much to the end of this session, but I think everyone got the chance to see the email from Dr. DeWitt. If you later on has questions, you can reach out to her for clarifications. We're also going to send out this presentation to your email later this afternoon. Dr. DeWitt, if you can move the slide, please, just to share a few things in the same. Yeah, just continue. Did you have anything else there, or well, this is your end slide? Okay, well, just to let know everybody that we try to keep speakers every month here for webinars. So next one is going to be about forest products, a holistic approach to sustainability. I'm going to be presenting on that. This is in commemoration of the Earth Day. So you're welcome to participate on this one as well. You will receive some invitations with the presentation later this afternoon. And next slide, please. For those that are here near to Raleigh area or Pittsburgh area, we're going to be tomorrow in a workshop about sustainability and pollution prevention from 8 to 1 p.m. We close registrations, but you're more than welcome to still join us tomorrow. Just the ones that registered in the time that we were taking on registrations will have a lunch meal, but you're more than welcome to join us tomorrow as well. And I think that concludes here. Next slide. Thank you very much, everyone, for your time. And we look forward to the next session in April. Stay in touch with us on our social media, LinkedIn, so we tend to post our events there in case you're interested in our next sessions. Have a great day. Bye-bye.